It is the single most important piece of software you own. You probably spend more time looking at it than the people you interact with. It is your go-to app, your entertainment center, your safe space, and your connection to the outside world. The web browser. And today, for nearly 70% of the human population online, that browser is Google Chrome. Chrome's dominance is so absolute that we barely even think about it anymore. Googling something and viewing it in Chrome feels like the natural state of the internet. But the internet wasn't always a one-party state. 30 years ago, the battle for the window through which you view the world was a brutal, high-stakes corporate war. It involved antitrust lawsuits that nearly broke up the biggest company on Earth, periods of agonizing stagnation, and sudden, violent bursts of innovation. Today, we're opening the history tabs. We're going back to the 90s to understand the first browser war, how Microsoft crushed the competition, how a small rebellion called Firefox lit a spark, and how Google, a search engine company, capitalized on the chaos to build the Chromium Empire. This is the story of how Chrome conquered the internet. Before 1993, the internet was largely a text-based academic tool. If you wanted to see a picture, you had to download a separate file. It was ugly. Then came Mosaic, the first graphical browser, and from Mosaic came Netscape Navigator. Netscape was the Google of the mid-90s. Their IPO in 1995 kicked off the dot-com boom. Navigator was revolutionary. It introduced things we take for granted today, like cookies and JavaScript. By 1996, nearly 90% of web users used Netscape. They were the kings of the new frontier. But they made a fatal mistake. They woke the giant in Redmond. Microsoft initially ignored the internet, but when Bill Gates realized Netscape was trying to turn the browser into the operating system, undermining Windows, he pivoted the entire massive company on a dime. The internal memo was called the Internet Tidal Wave. The first browser war had begun. Microsoft's weapon was Internet Explorer, or IE. The early versions were terrible. First released in 1995 for Windows 95, it grew to dominate the browser market, but security issues and competition from browsers led to its decline. But Microsoft had two advantages that Netscape couldn't beat. Number one, they had infinite money. They threw thousands of engineers at IE until it was surprisingly good by IE4. Number two, they cheated. Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with every copy of Windows. If you bought a PC in 1998, you had IE. Why would a normal person pay $40 for Netscape in a box at a store when the blue E was already on their desktop for free? Netscape hemorrhaged users. They couldn't compete with free and pre-installed. This tactic was so aggressive that it led to the historic United States versus Microsoft antitrust case. The government argued Microsoft was using its Windows monopoly to crush Netscape illegally. Microsoft technically lost the case in 2001, but by then, it didn't matter. The victim was already dead. AOL bought the husk of Netscape, and the blue E ruled a world. By 2003, Internet Explorer had a 95% market share. The war was over. Microsoft won. And then they did the worst possible thing for the internet. They stopped trying. If you used the internet between 2003 and 2007, you remember the dark ages. Internet Explorer 6 was a disaster. It was painfully slow, it didn't follow web standards, forcing developers to write broken code just to make sites work in IE, and security? It was non-existent. IE6 was a sieve for malware, spyware, and endless pop-up ads. Microsoft had won, disbanded the IE team, and let the internet rot. Why improve the browser when you have no competition? But in the ashes of Netscape, something was smoldering. Before they died, Netscape open-sourced their code, creating a nonprofit called Mosaic. For years, the Mosaic suite was bloated and niche, but a small group of developers decided to fork it. They wanted to build something lean, fast, and focused purely on browsing. They called it Phoenix, then Firebird, and finally, Firefox. Firefox 1.0 launched in 2004, and it felt like a revelation. If you were stuck on IE6, switching to Firefox was like stepping out of a murky cave into the sunlight. It had a pop-up blocker that actually worked. It was faster. It had extensions to customize the experience. But the killer feature? Tabs. Instead of opening 20 different windows cluttering your taskbar, you had one window with 20 tabs. It fundamentally changed how we organized our online lives. Firefox became the browser of the resistance. It was the cool, nerdy alternative to corporate Microsoft. By 2008, Firefox had clawed away nearly a quarter of the market. They proved the giant could bleed. But while Firefox was fighting the good fight, another giant was watching from the sidelines. A giant whose entire trillion-dollar business depended on the web actually working. By 2007, Google was the undisputed king of search. Their business model was simple. More people on the web means more searches, which means more ad revenue. But the web sucked. Google was trying to build advanced web applications like Gmail and Google Maps that ran inside the browser. But they were constantly being bottlenecked by the terrible performance of Internet Explorer and the slow JavaScript engines of the time. Internet Explorer was actively costing Google money by being bad. For years, Google CEO Eric Schmidt resisted building a browser. He didn't want to refight the bloody Microsoft wars of the 90s. But Larry Page and Sergey Brin hired engineers from the old Netscape team and secretly started building a prototype. When they showed it to Schmidt, it was so good he couldn't say no. In September 2008, Google launched Chrome, and in typical Google fashion, they didn't do a press conference. They sent out a literal comic book drawn by Scott McCloud to journalists explaining the technical architecture. And the architecture was radically different. Innovation number 1. Sandboxing. In older browsers, if one tab crashed, say a heavy Flash video, the entire browser crashed, taking all your work with it. Chrome treated each and every single tab as its own separate process. If one died, the other survived. It was incredibly stable. Innovation number 2. Speed. Google built a brand new JavaScript engine called V8. It didn't just interpret code, it compiled it into machine code on the fly. Suddenly, complex websites like Gmail ran almost as fast as desktop applications. V8 wasn't just an upgrade, it unlocked what the modern web could actually do. But the thing normal people noticed wasn't the JavaScript engine, it was the interface. Chrome was radically minimalist. No toolbars, no status bars at the bottom. Most importantly, it combined the address bar and the search bar into a single omnibox. You just typed, and Google figured out if it was a URL or a search. It got out of the way and let you look at the internet. It was clean, it was stable, and it was blazing fast. But having a better product isn't enough to conquer the world. You need distribution, and Google was about to flex its muscles. Google's initial marketing strategy was simple: speed. Every ad, every benchmark emphasized that Chrome was the fastest way to browse the web. And they didn't just iterate slowly. They adopted a rapid release cycle, pushing out new versions automatically in the background every 6 weeks. While Internet Explorer users waited 2 years for major updates, Chrome users were constantly on the cutting edge without even knowing it. But their biggest weapon was the most valuable real estate on the internet: the Google homepage. For years, billions of people visited https://google.com/search q=google.com every day. And there, in the corner, was a polite little pop-up suggesting they try Chrome. It was the ultimate growth hack. They also took a page out of Microsoft's playbook. They bundled Chrome with other software installers. Millions of people installed Chrome accidentally while trying to update Flash Player, only to realize they liked it better. The results were staggering. It took Chrome about 4 years to overtake Firefox. By 2013, it overtook Internet Explorer to become the #1 browser in the world. The second browser war was effectively over in 5 years. Chrome had blitzed the competition. Firefox, the noble resistance fighter, was squeezed. They couldn't match Google's engineering resources or their marketing power. They began a long, slow decline into niche status. Microsoft tried to fight back with newer versions of IE and eventually the new Edge browser, but the brand was too toxic. Nobody trusted the blue E anymore. By 2016, Chrome wasn't just winning, it was becoming the standard. When Google released Chrome, they also released the open source project behind it, Chromium. At first, this seemed benevolent, but as Chrome's dominance grew, Chromium became the de facto standard for how the web works. If developers wanted their websites to work for the majority of users, they optimized for Chrome first and everything else second. We returned to the bad old days of best viewed in Internet Explorer, only now it was best viewed in Chrome. The final nail in the coffin came in 2019. Microsoft threw in the towel. They announced that Edge browser would abandon its own engine and rebuild itself using Google's Chromium base. The war was truly over. Even Microsoft was now running on Google's engine. Today, if you use Chrome, Edge, Brave, Opera, or Vivaldi, you are essentially using a flavor of Chromium. The illusion of choice masks a technical monopoly. And this brings us to the modern paradox of Chrome. It is undeniably an excellent piece of software. It is fast, stable, and secure. The web of today, full of rich applications, video conferencing, and real-time collaboration, would not exist without the push Chrome gave it. But the hero has lived long enough to become the villain. Chrome is now the dominant force that Internet Explorer once was. Google controls the standards. They dictate how ads work on the web. They have immense power over user privacy. Critics argue Chrome has become spyware that happens to be a good browser, a tool to feed the massive Google data advertising machine. Many have fled back to Firefox or to privacy-focused Chromium forks like Brave, desperately trying to de-Google their lives. But the sheer gravity of Chrome's ecosystem is hard to escape. The history of the browser is the history of the Internet itself, from the Wild West of Netscape to the stagnation of the Internet Explorer monopoly to the lightning-fast revolution of Chrome. We traded the chaos of the early web for a sleek, standardized, Google-run world. The web works better now than it ever has. But it is also more centralized than it has ever been. Tech history tells us that no monopoly lasts forever. IBM, Microsoft, Nokia, they all seemed invincible right until the moment they weren't. Someday, a new paradigm will emerge. Maybe it's AR glasses, maybe it's AI interfaces that make traditional browsing obsolete. And Chrome, like Netscape and Internet Explorer before it, will become another icon in the digital history book. But for now, the war is over, and we are all living in the world Chrome built.